We saw a beautiful film this evening. It's Yom HaAtzmaut, it's Israel's Independence Day, and we're watching a film about the Shoah, about the Holocaust. And I actually want to go into your life, Matti, as a producer of this film, because I was reading about you. Your father actually is a survivor from Denmark, but he didn't talk about his own Holocaust experience. And I really want to focus this evening not necessarily on the survivors' generation, but really on the second and third generation of survivors. And so maybe you can share about your own life story as a child of a survivor. And the corollary to that question is, why this film at this moment?
So I want to thank you for inviting us to speak to you, and thank you for watching the film. I'll just, at the risk of correcting the rabbi right off the bat, I'll just start by saying that my father was actually a survivor from Czechoslovakia, not from Denmark.
Got it.
Although he did in fact serve as Israel's ambassador to Denmark at one point, which is why you might have gotten that not 100% right. I think growing up as the child of a survivor, you always have this sense that there's something kind of lurking underneath. And it took me a very long time to really be able to figure out what that was. And as an adult, I finally got my father to share his story with me. And I had I think the good sense to put it on tape. And so I interviewed him, and it was kind of a formal process. It was not like a father and son having a chat. It was more like I was playing the role of a journalist in a way and asking him questions. And he was pretty formal with his answers. But that was really the time that he told me the most about his experiences during the war. And actually, that tape is part of the permanent collection of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in D.C. And of course, I didn't know any of that was going to happen when I was doing it. I was just a young man trying to find out what happened to his father during the war. And I think that when I came across this script and I shared it with Joel, what we saw in it was the opportunity to tell the story of not only a survivor, but how it impacts his family and how he builds a life in America. And that that story, and specifically the story of how he survived and the PTSD that he lived with his whole life, was something that we hadn't quite seen in the canon of Holocaust films. And I think that's, from my own personal experience, but also from a much larger experience, that's what attracted us to the story.
If you read the book of Alan Haft, who wrote the, not script, but the tale of his father, he in fact also did not tell his story until very later in life. And the last few chapters of that book is Alan looking back at why his father did not tell that story, as we see in the film. So why this story right now?
Well, I think, right now is a really good question. I think we're living in a world where if we don't visit the Holocaust on a regular basis in a very strong way, we live in a world where we're vulnerable to the idea that it didn't happen. Mm-hmm. And that is a very compelling reason. Joel and I started our company, New Mandate Films, to tell these important stories and to focus in a large way, in a global way, the world on what we consider to be very, very important Jewish stories. And I think that there's a lot of money and a lot of effort spent on telling stories that are not complementary to Jews and against Jews. And we wanted to do that not in a way of propaganda, but in a way of telling real stories that ultimately promote the Jewish narrative. And I think that's what this film does pretty well.
And so let's turn it to Joel. After you graduated law school, your job was hunting down Nazis in this country, in the United States of America. What was your success in that? And then what did you see in Harry's story that you felt also you had to join with Matti in order to tell this story?
Yeah, Mike, Matti, thank you very much for having us. I'm actually speaking from Israel. It's had the birth of our second granddaughter, so we've been here for a while. So appreciate it. My story is much different. I'm not from the entertainment industry at all. I'm from the investment world. I was fortunate enough to meet Matti 5-6 years ago, and we decided to form this company. As you said, right out of law school from New York, went to the Office of Special Investigations, the U.S. Department of Justice, to join the Nazi hunting unit. many people don't know this, but right after the war, along with many survivors and many other refugees from Europe, about 10,000 Nazis entered the country illegally, some of whom actually were recruited here legally, here being the United States, to help build the U.S. space program. But that's a story for many other days. So I did that. That was really my first, simultaneously with marrying my wife, my first real education and introduction to survivors. All four of my grandparents were born in the United States. So unlike many people here in Israel, and unlike the survivor communities in the United States, I knew maybe one survivor who was a friend of my father's. Survivors lived by themselves. I didn't really know many survivors. Once I went to work for the Justice Department, I met many survivors in the course of the cases that we were prosecuting to have some of the Nazis who came into the country illegally deported back to their home countries. At the same time, I married my wife, who's the child of two survivors, one of whom has a story somewhat similar to Harry. He was born in Poland. He went through 3 camps, including Auschwitz. By a miracle, he was also reunited with his only surviving brother from a very large family in Auschwitz, and he was eventually liberated from Germany. So there were some similarities to Harry's story. My wife's mother, my father-in-law unfortunately died in November. My wife's mother is still alive. She was a hidden child in Slovakia. So once I married into that family, I really became aware of the survivor community and what the survivors faced, not only to survive the war. And again, my in-laws had 2 different experiences. One went through 3 brutal camps. My mother-in-law was basically hidden as a 5-year-old. So I saw the different age, the age variations, and also what it took to survive in hiding, or heard what it took to survive in hiding, as well as to survive those brutal concentration camps. So that knowing that and understanding some of the survivor community, although not having grown up with it, I really thought it was important, as Matti said, an important story to tell. At the same time, one of the most important parts of the story that I think has never really been fully explored on the screen until this movie was really what it took for the survivors to build a life after the war. In terms of both of my in-laws, my mother-in-law was orphaned. As I said, my father-in-law only had one surviving sibling, and they each suffered tremendous loss and tremendous trauma. But somehow they made it to this country. They had a family. They educated their kids, and they led successful lives. And as you saw in the movie, I think that much of that story, that trauma, and the PTSD around that has never been explored. And I think that's what the film does brilliantly and really brings to light for audiences around the world, both the experience of survival and then surviving the survival. I would also say one thing I want to talk about very briefly is that many people don't know that there are still about 75,000 survivors alive in the United States, and about 400,000 around the world. Depending where they are, about 1/3 to 1/2 of those survivors are living in poverty. Even in the United States, there's 25,000 survivors living in poverty, which is a tremendous shame for the countries we live in, as well as the Jewish community.
And so, Billy, I want to turn to you for a moment, because to interview not just an actor, but to somebody who has to put themselves in a villain's costume and a villain mentality, and not in a make-believe type of role, but literally as a Nazi. What was your education actually growing up about the Holocaust, about the Jewish community, and how did you not just put your mind to it, but how did you build that relationship with Harry Haft, meaning Ben Foster, and how did you go on that screen and do exactly what you needed to do?
Thank you, Rabbi, for having me, first of all. I grew up in Queens, New York, so I grew up with a big Jewish community, basically, and also I'm in the entertainment industry, which has a very big Jewish community, and I got to meet beautiful Matti Leshsem over there while performing this story. I actually, funny enough, went to Little Dolphins. It was called Jewish. It was a Jewish school actually in New York. But again, you were in the education system, going to a private school and stuff like that growing up, and learning about the history of, Europe and the world. And constantly being curious about it, I guess you can say. Basically, why I'm in the entertainment industry is to understand stories of every character in this world. So fascinating by that, and that, the human experience can have something with such an atrocity such as this is fascinating, and sad and scary and not meant to be repeated. And I think the more we can tell this story over and over again, the more we can, hopefully save people and, prevent things from happening. What were the other questions? So sorry. It's so early in the morning for me.
How were you able to put yourself into the role of playing a Nazi on the screen? What did that take mentally?
More specifically, I think I put myself into the role of playing another kind of survivor in World War II. He was, again, like, no one's a villain in their own story. It's hard to talk about this and be gentle about it. It's not a good character. It's not like, I remember when I was doing research, it's scary to realize this, but like, there were, officers that they did these crazy things, but then went home on the weekend.
Right. And
had their vacation home. And it's really scary to think about that. But coming up with Schneider, it was a guy trying to survive because he knew the Third Reich was going to fall. And he had to find his way out. He had to find his way out. And Harry was his key and his tool to escape his own story. Everyone's living their own journey, and no one's the villain in their own life. It's so hard to talk about this in a light manner, especially when you put the veil of something so horrible on. But again, just telling stories, and I think the most important thing is to tell the PTSD. And like Joel was talking about, the aftermath of what these people went through, because we don't know what, honestly, the weight of the world that people are carrying on their shoulders every day. And it's just more important to share it and not hide from it.
So I want to go back to Matti for a moment and talk about the role of sports within the Holocaust, which we don't often speak about. And here you have boxing as a way of survival, but really also as a way of killing others. And we obviously learned that the reason why he wanted to continue his boxing career after is to come to this country to find Leia. Maybe you can talk about the role of sports. I know it sounds so strange, but within the Holocaust, and how in these moments it led to him boxing one of the greats, Rocky Marciano, who's in the Boxing Hall of Fame in Canastota, New York, and what that meant to Harry throughout his life, as you saw, trying to even teach his own son to box and be tough. So what is the role of sport within this survival story?
I mean, it's an incredible thing. And actually, I'm going to just touch on something that Billy said, which is, these are, guys who went to the death camp, put people to death, and then went home and, played with the children, right? The Nazis were obsessed with sports, and there were actually quite a few boxing leagues in Auschwitz and various other camps. There were soccer leagues. We can talk a little bit about music as well. The Nazis really looked at those camps as a place for their entertainment, which really is so shocking when you think about that they were just death camps, and that on their way to the death, some people would do better if they could essentially amuse the Nazis. And this part of the story, this was Harry's thing, is that Harry was just a scrappy guy, and in fact, the Schneider character discovers him, and Schneider was a guy who, he really was doing it for the money. Like he got kind of hooked on it, but like it was a betting scheme at first. And so when someone had the ability to perform, it kept them alive. And, Harry was not the only boxer. Now, obviously, Harry was fighting in a sub camp of Auschwitz, Jaworzno, or the Germans called it Neudax, which was a coal mining camp, actually, which was just a brutal camp to be at. And that's where most of the fights occurred. But in all of the camps, they had sports as part of the camp. So that's where where it started, right? And then Harry, he was functionally illiterate. He really was completely uneducated. And what he knew how to do was fight. And so when he comes to the new world, this was also a time in America where boxing was something the Jews did. In the 30s and 40s, there were quite a few boxers and some very good boxers as well. And so it was not that unusual if you had the ability. That was something you could get into. If you were Black, if you were Jewish, if you were a member, if you were Italian, you could get into boxing. And of course, that's what he did. And there are actually, there are parts of Harry's story that are not in the film where, the mob tries to shake him down at one point and they try to put pressure on his manager for him to actually throw the fight with Marciano, and he doesn't. And, he ends up losing anyway. But I think the beauty of the story is that part of his immigrant's experience was like, how is he going to make a life for himself here? And he was obsessed with finding Leah, and he couldn't really think of anything else to do or how to let him know. And so he tries to get the biggest fight that he can. And somehow he manages to get a fight with Rocky Marciano, who of course became the undefeated world champ. And Marciano very accurately in the film depicts how he cleaned Harry's clock in the third round. I mean, it was a brutal, brutal fight. So that's really, it is kind of a sports movie in a way too.
And do you know, and I'm not sure if you know this or not, what was Rocky Marciano's knowledge of who his opponent was in his history? I didn't see that in the book or even in the film. I don't know if that's known.
Rocky Marciano touched on in a very oblique way. The character of Charlie Goldman, of course, is a true story. Like Charlie Goldman, who was Rocky's trainer, really did help Harry and trained him in secret, which is kind of a crazy thing to think of. And it was this kind of like Landsman moment where he was like, look, I can't help you win, but I'm going to help you lose with dignity, right? And I don't think Marciano paid attention to anybody he was fighting. I think Marciano was a consummate professional. He did what Charlie told him, and he went out there. Charlie's got that great little moment in the movie where he says, you know what the guy does before a fight? He lies down and he takes a nap, and then he gets up and he beats the shit out of somebody. And that is the case with Rocky Marciano. He was, an incredible talent. And so I don't think Marciano thought much about Harry other than, oh, here's another opponent they're going to put. It was pretty early in Marciano's career, too, if you think about it. So not much.
Joel, I want to go to you again to what you referenced in terms of people creating their lives after the war, whether it's in Israel, whether it's America, wherever they were living. And there's a moment in the film towards the end when Alan asks his dad, who is she? And his father responds, she saved my life. And that was the opening moment for him to begin to tell his story. My question, Joel, is how do we allow people who have gone through trauma to find these openings to share? Thankfully, Harry had this moment. Do we create those moments? Is this film a moment where others can begin to share?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, this is from my experience with my in-laws and knowing their history and knowing how my wife would tell the story, is that I think each survivor of these genocides tells it when they're ready and in their own time. For example, my wife would say that for her father, she doesn't remember a time that she didn't know his story. And he told the story often. And he wanted people to understand the story, so the story would not be repeated. That story of the Holocaust not be repeated. So he was very open in sharing. There were other members of her family, my wife's family, that told very, very little. She had an aunt, a great aunt, who survived Auschwitz and was part of the Mengele experiments and could never have children. She shared very, very, very little. Interestingly, my mother-in-law, who was, as I said, was a hidden child, she wouldn't say much about her story growing up, but just in Israel, she was here for the birth of her great-grandchild, She, for the first time ever publicly on Yom HaShoah, told her story. She had told it privately, but she finally, after the death of her husband, decided that it was important enough so that people continue the story. And at this point, many of the survivors of the death camps, there are very few left because they were generally older. It's really now falling upon the people the hidden children to carry on telling the story. So she decided in front of 100 Israeli soldiers to tell the story. And it's a very traumatic and dramatic story, but she realized it's very important to tell that story. So I think, I don't know when the right time. I think that's such a personal decision, but at the same time, it's really important that people tell these stories to understand what the human race is capable of. And I just want to follow up on what Matti and Billy said. Through my time at the Office of Special Investigations, where I was able to interview and interrogate not only survivors, but a number of the perpetrators, I would say, and they were all men, not that all the perpetrators were men, they were women, but just in my caseload, we're all men. To a man, they either said two things. Some would deny it, but with all the evidence we had, most wouldn't deny it. But to a man, they would say they were literally just following orders. They had no choice. What would they have expected us to do in similar situations? So that issue of like where they really felt personal responsibility, I would say to a man, none of them did, even though they were all, we had evidence of all of them doing, committing atrocities.
Billy, I want to ask you about your relationship with Ben Foster, who played Harry Haft in the film. And you took one route in terms of, creating a Nazi image and how difficult it was for you. And Ben Foster took another route where I read that he lost literally 60 pounds because he didn't want to digitally look like a survivor, but he wanted to physically feel what this would be like. What was your relationship as two actors playing these very different roles against each other?
I just have great admiration for Ben. I remember showing up in Budapest where we shot, and I didn't really meet Ben until like probably we shot there a month, and it wasn't until our last day of shooting the flashbacks that we sat down and had a meal together and had a drink that I really got to meet Ben. We both kind of went into this process with creating our characters and knowing our positions as we moved through it, and nothing blurred those lines. It was a really unique process, and not one that I usually do. And I wouldn't say we were method actors or anything like that. We communicated really well, but felt the gravity and the importance of telling the story, and we wanted to do it properly without any interference at all.
The kind of reverence that they had towards the story that they were telling, it's like they weren't palling around on set. They really stayed out of each other's way to just completely commit to the parts. And I think that was an important part. It's like they found their relationship on screen. And then I think to your point, Billy, like you didn't really meet Ben until the end. It's like
but also it was still a respectful, gracious, great. I was so grateful for the relationship we had. We trusted each other. As we moved through this process of filming, there was communication, but we weren't chum buddies. We were two, dedicated performers to this, telling the story properly, and we didn't want anything to interfere with that. So again, like I'm just so grateful to be a part of it and have this experience with this amazing crew of people, and Ben as well. He was awesome. It was just so funny. We didn't really know each other until we got to sit down, and so he started eating again, and then he brightened up a lot. It was a unique experience, but
So
I hold it so deep here.
As the number of survivors are diminishing in the world, as Joel explained, when there are no more survivors and we watch this film and my children and grandchildren watch this film, what is the lesson that they should take when they learn education of the Holocaust through the unbelievable film that you created?
I think, the most important thing is for them to understand, it's such a difficult thing to actually wrap your head around. I've lived with the Holocaust and the specter of the Holocaust my entire life. And it took a long time to make this film. And the truth is you can never really spend enough time delving into it to understand what the absolute annihilation of the Jewish people was, what part not only the Nazis, but in many cases other countries had, and what part they played in it, and also what is the seed of the hatred of genocide is really important. And I hope that your children and your grandchildren can understand that, certainly in light of what happened to their people, but also as it reflects on the rest of the world. And I think that's the thing that we, it's not enough to say never again. Like, we have an obligation to actively remember, and certainly for us who are lucky enough to be able to tell these stories and get them out to the world, it's a privilege. But I think it's something that we can all do. It's like, tell your friends to watch the film, discuss it, talk about it with your children. I remember screening this, children in a cut, the film in a cut for my children who are a little bit older now, in their early and mid 20s. And it spurred on some really, amazing conversations that we hadn't had. And I think the other thing is that because we're going to lose all the survivors in the next, I guess, 15 years or so, there will be no survivors left. It's up to us, the next generation, the sons of survivors and the grandsons and granddaughters of survivors, to continue to tell those stories and to pass those on to the next generations, because we can never let it lapse in our collective memory.
One small detail question and then a larger question for each of you to conclude with. In the book, the reunion for Leah and Harry was in Florida, but in the movie, it's, I believe, in Georgia, Tybee Island. I'm wondering if that was a detail that I missed, or that was something specific.
I will answer it because it was a production question. The thing that's important about it, Alan was, of course, on that trip and remembered it pretty well. And the thing that, what he talked about was, coming from where they were living in Brooklyn, all of a sudden they go down to this place and it was like palm trees and blue waters. And like, he remembered that in a kind of a visceral way. And so we knew that we wanted to achieve that no matter where we went. We just couldn't find a way to actually shoot it in Miami, but we wanted to capture the essence of that feeling. And we were able to shoot it in Tybee Island, Georgia. So we simply changed the location. I mean, that is part of filmmaking. It's not a documentary.
Same as sermon writing. No.
By the way, very much like sermon writing, you're telling a story.
Right. No, absolutely. Absolutely. So the last question is about Alan, because for me, I was so fascinated by him in terms of him not understanding, both in the written word and also in the film, why his father was like this for his entire life. And Alan's not a young man anymore. And I watched a YouTube clip of him, and he's finally telling his story, or his dad's story, through him. What was the process, not just through the book, but of working with Alan, and what has Alan's reaction been to this film, both to you, Matti, to you, Billy, perhaps, if you've had a chance to speak with him, and to you, Joel, as well?
I don't think it was easy to be Harry Haft's kid, and I think Alan will tell you that. But Alan has vindicated the ghosts of his past and Harry's past with the brave writing of this book that we were privileged enough to take and turn into a screenplay and then into a film.
And Joel, I know you're sitting in Israel. What was the reaction in the state of Israel with this film coming out just on Yom HaShoah?
I think that's a great question, very perceptive question. That seeing it, and Matti was here for the premiere. I think the difference between seeing it in the United States and seeing it in Israel is that almost everyone in the audience here, many people in Israel, have a direct connection to the Holocaust. And by that, I mean, they know someone who survived, immediate family member, a grandparent, an aunt or uncle, great aunt, great uncle who survived, or they know many members of their family perished. Now, the movie itself, I think, relates to everyone, even those with not a personal relationship with someone who died in the Shoah. But seeing it in Israel, there was just really stunned silence. And Maddie and I have a few close friends here, and they all related back to their relationship with their parents. Whether they talked about the Holocaust, they didn't talk about it. And I think it brought up a lot of really very, very powerful memories. And I think that's that was the point of the movie, and I think the point of the performances, from Billy's to Ben's to everyone else in the film, that you really felt like you knew these characters and what they went through. And then certainly if you know someone who did survive the Holocaust, it magnified that a great deal.
So I want to thank everybody for joining us here at Sinai Temple, virtually as well, to Matti Leshem, to Joel Greenberg, to Billy Magnussen. Billy, your performance on screen really is going to be truly important for the next generation, not just of Jews, but everybody learning this story of the Holocaust and of the Jewish people. As we say, Yehi Zichram Baruch, may those lives lost within the Shoah and the Holocaust truly be a blessing for all time, and we should say Amen. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good evening.